Ubisoft. What the hell happened? It's kind of alien to think back to a time where seeing a new Ubisoft game being announced in a magazine or on TV was something to get excited about. I know that I struggle to think of one of their games made within the last 5 years that I really enjoyed, or at least wanted to get, and it seems like a lot of other people share this sentiment now. The last Ubisoft game I remember getting was Far Cry 5, which... that is a game that exists. The French-based publisher has been in the spotlight recently because stonks, which corresponds to their general trend of releasing largely copy-pasted sequels, as well as the odd quadruple A game that maybe 10 people continue to play just weeks after release. I think this whole situation has managed to generate a little bit of optimism for players. There is a chance, however slight, that big studios and publishers might soon realize that the best way to make money in this industry is to make good, interesting, and perhaps unique games. Imagine that. Whether Ubisoft goes bankrupt and is forced to sell off all of its IPs, or if the Tencent buyout rumors are actually true and everyone in the company is suddenly forced to learn Mandarin, I think the market might finally be correcting itself. Nonetheless, it is a little bit sad that we've had to reach this point. As a publishing studio, Ubisoft was at one point a company that wasn't afraid to take risks. If you scroll through every game they've ever published, you will find a surprising variety of different genres, concepts, and ideas. Some of which fade into obscurity, sure, along with the companies behind them. But they did also have quite the knack at finding some very talented studios that would go on to make a name for themselves well up to the present day. Gearbox Software, Bethesda, Blue Byte, fucking From Software for like 2 games? All companies that were at least at some point involved in a publishing agreement with Ubisoft. And that's just the stuff they didn't even make themselves. In the 2000s, one of their subsidiaries in particular, Ubisoft Montreal, had a very impressive streak of introducing new franchises that were so successful, they're still trying to milk them for all they've got left. Well, maybe most of them. This really culminated in 2012, with the release of both Assassin's Creed 3 and Far Cry 3, which combined into a massive 22 million copies sold within the next 2 years. The thing that Ubisoft doesn't seem to understand now is, back then, this success was earned. Just look at how Assassin's Creed 2 managed to tap the potential of its predecessor, taking this innovative idea of an open-world, free-running assassin game and refining it into what a lot of people still consider to be the finest the series has to offer today. You're literally friends with a Da Vinci twin, I mean, come on bro. But you know what video you clicked on. This isn't about Assassin's Creed, because I want to go all the way back to 2002. To the first original IP developed by the Montreal studio, as well as the first Ubisoft game I have any real memory of playing. The game that apparently still has a remaster in the works. And that game, of course, is Tom Clancy's Splinter Cell. Stealth Action Redefined. When I was around 6 years old, I had 2 favorite video game characters. One was Sam Fisher, and the other was Sonic the Hedgehog. My therapist told me I should share this with everyone because it explains a lot. I don't know what she means by this. The Sonic obsession makes sense. Sonic heroes, hello? And they had that little shit on Jetix breath. All this talk about vaccines nowadays, but no one is brave enough to talk about the fact that they were literally beaming autism into our brains through like multiple mediums. But the Sam Fisher thing, that seems a bit weird in comparison. Especially if you consider that I never even beat the fucking game back then. In fact, I don't know if I even managed to get past the first real mission. By the time I would have been old enough to actually try, I was already Chaos Theory pilled. And at that point I never really looked back. And yet, there was clearly something about this first game that managed to resonate with me. Replaying the game now, and actually beating it for the first time, helped me to understand what exactly made this game special. And I think the best place to start is with Tom Clancy. In August of the year 2000, Red Storm Entertainment, founded by author Tom Clancy, was acquired by Ubisoft. The studio had managed to develop a surprising amount of games within the 3 years they had been in operation, though they became most associated with Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six. a tactical shooter based on Tom Clancy's novel of the same name, which sought to portray realism in its gameplay mechanics and general presentation. When Red Storm Entertainment was acquired, Ubisoft got the rights to the Tom Clancy name as a brand. It was soon decided that the Montreal team would develop a brand new IP under this umbrella. They dusted off an unfinished concept they worked on a few years prior titled The Drift, which at the time had gone nowhere. Though not before almost being pitched to the rights holders of James Bond of all things. But the connotations associated with the Tom Clancy's brand managed to breathe some new life into the original idea behind the Drift project.
When you develop under Tom Clancy franchise, it means that you need to validate and to justify everything.
That is Matthew Furland, the senior producer behind Splinter Cell, explaining how just having the name Tom Clancy attached to their project encouraged the Montreal team to take realism and believability more seriously when it came to pretty much every aspect of the game. The results speak for themselves, as we'll see in a short while. However, it is kind of interesting that Furland is speaking here in the context of the story and setting of the game. I do think that they managed to achieve this sense of believability for the most part, but the story does start off on a bit of an interesting note. Basically, Georgia, the country, experiences a bloodless coup, and the United States government just doesn't give a shit. I mean, the vice president even flies down there to shake hands with the traitor, which maybe would make sense if the previous government was favorable to, like, Russia or something, and this new guy Nicolaides wanted to force a more western-facing approach. But they go out of their way to mention that the previous coup government was, in fact, seeking to form closer ties to the West. Why this isn't raising some alarm bells in the White House is a mystery. He did give everyone in the country access to high-speed internet though, so fuck it. I guess he's based. This ends up how you might expect. Turns out, this new president has a secret genocide plot against the people of Azerbaijan. Wow, who would have thought that this traitor against his western-facing government might have some unsavory ambitions? Anyway, that's probably as bad as the story in this game gets, at least as far as the premise goes. Thinking back, I think something that really appealed to me with Sam Fisher was just how different he was from the other action game characters that I was used to up to that point. He has a presence that is hard to explain without resorting to a certain R word again. But even the way he moves around like you might expect him to for an older, albeit experienced, field operative was quite fresh for the time. You can feel the trauma his body endures as he braces down on impact from a high fall. He huffs and puffs on his highest running speed, which really can only be described as a brisk jog. The sound of his boots thumping against the ground as he runs is accompanied by the sound of his equipment getting tossed around on his body. Tasks like climbing up on ledges or changing the way he's facing while dangling from a pipe, which in other games would be over in a matter of a few frames, feel like they take actual effort to perform for Sam. He's not a young man after all, dude's pushing like what, 85?
I'm gonna kill you.
Well fuck. Stuff like this made this character feel believable. Downright fucking real as far as my underdeveloped brain was concerned. Like this dude could actually be out there in Georgia somewhere causing a ruckus in a local PD. Just like Sonic, to be fair. And by the way, that was kind of the intention.
We really want the player to feel that, oh my god, this could happen for real, like tomorrow.
A lot of thought also went into the design of Sam Fisher. It's never really been a secret that Splinter Cell was, at least in part, inspired by the Metal Gear Solid series. Hell, the first concept designs of Sam Fisher look like they could have been ripped straight out of the MGS universe. Two high-ranking figures working for Ubisoft during the development of Splinter Cell are credited for saying something to this effect. One of whom being executive producer Matthew Furland, who you saw not long ago. Scriptwriter and designer for the game Clint Hawking also praised the Metal Gear games for paving a way for success for third-person stealth games in a GamesCritic article published in May of 2005. Though he, simultaneously, implies that influenced wouldn't be the right word to use. I will come back to this again when I go in depth about the stealth mechanics of this game, but one thing is for certain. Ubisoft wanted a character as iconic as Solid Snake. However, they went into this with that same goal of some level of realism and believability in his design. All of the equipment Sam uses in the game, including his clothing, weapons, as well as a lot of the gadgets, was based on either gear that was already used by Special Forces units at the time, or which was otherwise in a developmental or prototype stage. Reasoning being that since the game took place in 2004, or 2 years after the release of the game, this more outlandish, prototypical equipment could have reasonably been fielded within that time. However, realistic gear alone doesn't an iconic character make. I think that when most people think of Sam Fisher, they instinctually picture the green hue of his trademark three-eyed goggles. And I mean, that was the intention, being heavily borrowed from the headband that made Snake so instantly recognizable. But the thing that really stands out for me most of all is perhaps the voice.
Sam's a very frightened guy, you know. That's why he sort of walks in and does stuff like, "Hi, I'm gonna kill you." Because if you're a happy guy, you come in and go, "Hi, I'm gonna kill you."
I don't know if Sam Fisher would have made anywhere near as much of an impact if it wasn't for the gravelly voice of Michael Ironside. The best way I can describe his performance as Sam is to say that it is texturally dark, which, if you pair it with the main stealth mechanic of the game, makes it a match made in heaven. It's such a perfect pairing that it would go on to create problems for Ubisoft later down the line, when Ironside was unable to reprise his role for the last game in the series due to being diagnosed with cancer, and they decided to bring Sam Fisher back anyway with a different voice actor. But that's beyond the scope of this video. I will say that, while the voice is perfect, Fisher isn't really much of a character yet in this game. He really starts to develop a sense of humor in Pandora Tomorrow, and Chaos Theory achieves what I consider to be his peak as a natural feeling character in these games. Here though, he's pretty serious for the most part. I think I counted like 3 jokes by the time the credits rolled, and the few attempts the game makes at trying to give him depth, like introducing his daughter Sarah, fall flat for the most part.
You're dying, Max.
This sense of believability we've been talking about so far extends beyond just the character of Sam Fisher though. A mission that shows off what I want to talk about here really well is actually the training level. Right at the start, the game wants to teach you how to move the camera to look around. Where a Metal Gear Solid game might have the colonel ring you up on your radio to tell you something like,
"Fisher, look around," by firmly grasping your mouse with your hand and dragging it to the left across your desk.
As charming as that is in its own way, Splinter Cell puts it in the context of your technicians wanting to calibrate your sensors before you begin with the assault course. This is something I came to appreciate about the entire game. It does its best to try and contextualize a lot of the things you do within its own game world. This small part of the tutorial is just a small contributor towards something that I think the first 3 games in this series do a really good job at overall, which is grounding the gameplay in some sort of realism. Another example of this happens later on in the Covert Ops training, when Lambert informs you that there are CIA instructors present who have kindly volunteered to be our victims, to help us practice sneaking up on people, knocking them out, and interrogating them. Having said that, it is kind of funny to then still see Sam bricking them across the head just as he will with actual enemies later. There are a lot more of these types of things I could still talk about. But what I think is clear so far is that, as far as it came to mainstream video games of the time, Splinter Cell was particularly set on buying the player in on the believability of its gameplay. However, I know what you might be thinking at this point. We are this far into a video about Splinter Cell, and this guy with the weird accent has barely even mentioned anything about this sneaking stuff. I know.
Kept you waiting, huh?
So without further ado, let's take a look at how, or if, Splinter Cell redefined stealth action. I think before we get into the nitty-gritty of talking about the stealth mechanics, it would be good to briefly talk about the premise of Splinter Cell. Because despite 6 mainline entries spanning 11 years, including what is probably in my top 5 favorite games of all time, I couldn't really have told you much about what a Splinter Cell even is, or why the NSA even needs an operative like Sam in this universe. And I know why that is too, it's because by the time the last game came out, I was still only 14. I didn't give a fuck about the story. So why do we need all of this sneaky spy bullshit when we have technology? The game itself doesn't actually have very many answers to these questions, other than explaining that Sam has been selected to spearhead the NSA's Third Echelon Initiative. Those answers are instead in the game's manual, because this was a time where developers still actually put some effort into them. The basic gist is that in this universe, intelligence gathering has become increasingly more difficult due to the widespread use of digital encryption technology. Collecting security-related intelligence through technology alone is in fact so cucked that it's actually deemed easier and more efficient to send operatives directly to the source to gather intelligence in person. The NSA created the secret Third Echelon Initiative specifically for this purpose, and the operatives they send in to gather this critical intelligence are dubbed Splinter Cells. Because, like a sliver of glass, a Splinter Cell is small, sharp, and nearly invisible. So I already briefly talked about the link between Splinter Cell and Metal Gear Solid in the previous section when it came to creating an iconic stealth protagonist. Where I left off, I mentioned that Clint Hawking implied influenced wasn't the right word to use. I will first of all say that, to me, the only real similarities between Splinter Cell and the first two Metal Gear Solid games, besides having a recognizable main character, are that they're both stealth games based in a near-future setting. But when it comes to gameplay, presentation, story writing, I think the comparisons become more general. Later in that same article, Hawking brings up two interesting studios of note: Looking Glass and Ion Storm. And if you really look at what Splinter Cell ended up being, the stealth mechanics of games like System Shock and Deus Ex really do offer a lot more points of comparison. But if there is one Looking Glass series that had an undeniable influence on the development of Ubisoft Montreal's first project, it has to be Thief. The mechanical similarities between Splinter Cell and Thief are quite easy to see if you know anything about the two series, but perhaps the most obvious one is that both games encourage the player to hide in the dark. However, Splinter Cell takes that idea and stakes its entire identity on it. When you think Sam Fisher, you think of the goggles, but when you think of the game, sneaking around in the dark is the first thing that comes to mind. It defines the entire series. This game was created on Unreal Engine 2, which, for the time it was released, was kind of a big deal. The detailed lighting technology that made this game what it is today was arguably made possible because of this engine. Whereas its predecessor, UE1, was at least initially built to rely only on software encoding, i.e. using the computer's CPU to render graphics, Unreal 2 was built from the ground up to take full advantage of GPU hardware rendering. This was in a time of a blossoming consumer GPU market that was kicked off in the late 90s, first pioneered by 3DFX with the Voodoo series of cards, with Nvidia taking up the mantle just before the turn of the century. Along with this also came DirectX 8 compatibility, which combined with this engine to turn this lighting technology into something more than just a pretty sight for the eyes. You can see how exposed you are to light at any time thanks to this meter on the bottom right of the heads-up display. It's introduced in the Covert Ops section of the training mission, and I once again want to say that I appreciate the game trying to give some sort of believable explanation as to how we have access to this information, with Lambert explaining that Sam's suit has a network of photocells which detect light and display the data on the OPSAT. As he himself puts it,
"If the meter's at 4, you're lit up like a Dutch brothel. At 0, you're a ghost's shadow."
Even though the meter is divided into 5 sections, it does react to very slight changes in exposure. What that means for gameplay is that if you see a part of the map where you can't quite tell how lit up it is, because you are completely invisible while the meter is anywhere within that left section, you can slowly sneak your way towards exposed areas and test them by seeing how the light meter reacts to you doing so. If it looks like it's just going to keep going up and up past 0, you should be careful if there are enemies nearby. Having said that, there have been at least a couple of instances where I felt like I should have been obscured by darkness, and yet the light meter disagreed. Like this one in the third mission that takes place on an oil rig, which ended up getting me killed, or here in the garage section of the Defense Ministry level. It is quite rare, but sometimes what the player sees is different to what the game thinks you are seeing. The game also gives the player the ability to manipulate the lighting of an environment in a couple of ways, to make stealth traversal easier. When it comes to a more nonchalant approach to get rid of lights, you can, of course, use things like light switches and, well, that's kind of it. For a more immediate, though more detectable way of creating darkness, you can always just shoot lights out with one of your weapons. This was a big selling point for the game when it launched, but something they didn't really mention was how annoying shooting at, well, anything can be in this game. Your weapons tend to be just a little bit inaccurate. The FS-2000 is serviceable, even quite usable when you aim down its scope, but you don't get that weapon until the latter half of the 4th mission. And the inaccuracy of the pistol is pretty nuts. Of course, there is a good reason for this. The entire point of a stealth game like Splinter Cell is to sneak, not to fight. It's a good thing then that the game doesn't force you to engage in combat at any point. Right? Sam's shortcomings with his weapons are coupled with the fact that he really can't take all that much damage if he gets surrounded by more than a couple of angry goons. It would kind of defeat the entire point of the game if you could just mark your targets in advance, run into a room and be able to wipe out like 5 guys, burgers and fries in hand, before any of them even manage to get a single bite. The unintended effect of that, and I know it's unintended because they fixed it in their next game, is that shooting anything becomes a roll of the dice, including lights, which is a fairly important part of the game. If you have particularly shit luck, it can sometimes take you like half a magazine to be able to hit a light with your pistol that's more than 20 feet away depending on RNG. The next Splinter Cell game Montreal worked on was Chaos Theory, and they clearly recognized this to be a problem because that's the game where they introduced the OCP gadget. An accurate electromagnetic disruptor with frankly generous range that silently knocked out lights, cameras and other electronics for a brief amount of time. Enough for you to be able to sneak past or to cause a distraction. So that's the main way to hide from enemies in the game, but what about movement? The first 3 Splinter Cell games had a fairly unique control system when it came to the PC. Console players had the luxury of analog controls, so controlling the speed of movement was as easy as controlling how much pressure you applied to the stick. If you want to move slowly, just push the left stick ever so slightly forward. But to retain the same level of control on PC, a different solution had to be found. Sam Fisher can move around at 5 different speeds, both crouched and upright. For the sake of this video, 1 is the slowest and 5 is the fastest. On PC, you cycle through the different speeds by scrolling the mouse wheel. Crouching around at speed 1 makes you completely silent. But so does speed 2. In fact, even at speed 3 you can get away with a lot, though not as much as I was expecting. I am far more used to how the Chaos Theory controls work, on account of having what is probably a couple hundred hours of playtime in that game combined over the years. And in that game, moving around on speed 3 is completely silent 99.999% of the time, with the only exceptions being some rare floor surface types. But if I tried sneaking up on someone in this game at the same speed, more often than not they would hear me and start blasting. I think this might depend on background noise and maybe even surface types, though I can't be sure because there isn't really a reliable way to track that like there is in Chaos Theory. This had a side effect that at first I found to be a little bit frustrating, though I was able to eventually adapt to it. Sneaking up on patrolling enemies is surprisingly hard. At speed 2, you are silent, but you're also not fast enough to keep up with them. At speed 3, you can outpace them to catch up, but then they're also more likely to hear you when you get close. Because of this, I eventually learned to just do one of 2 things. Either try to sneak past undetected, or if I really needed to take someone out, try to predict where they're going to go and wait along their patrol route. I did that for the first half of the game, whereas I became a lot more trigger happy towards the end. There was a big reason for this that ultimately pushed me over the edge, which I will talk about soon. Even after figuring out that the most reliable way to sneak up on enemies was to try and meet them somewhere along their patrol route, it wasn't really completely smooth sailing from here. Patrolling enemies don't always behave in a predictable way. There were a lot of times in my playthrough where an enemy would all of a sudden perform a weird 180 turn for seemingly no reason, or where they would take a wide turn around the corner, presumably because they really wanted to feel me up in the dark. This wasn't all that common, but, well, let's just say there was a little bit of a turtle head action happening during a lot of my encounters in this game. The totality of the control system feels as though it's like 80% of the way there already, which, for the first game in the series, is pretty impressive in all fairness. Generally, moving Sam around feels responsive and predictable. I don't think I ever found myself blaming the movement controls for being spotted by enemies throughout my playthrough. There's only one stealth-related movement mechanic that I found to be a bit unintuitive, and it's pretty specific. When Sam hits the ground from a certain height, he will sometimes land in the standing position, which creates a lot of noise, alerting any enemies nearby. But if you press the stance button just as he's about to touch the ground, he will instead crouch, making the fall silent. Now that I think about it, the few kinks this system has only show themselves when the game starts to throw platforming sections at you, which you'd be very surprised at how many platforming sections they throw at you by the end of this campaign. A contender for the worst of these shows up at the end of the assault course, where Lambert goes,
"Your final challenge. Wall pipe that hoe." Oh hell no, your ass tweaking, Lambert!
This move shows up like a handful of times throughout the campaign, and if you ever feel like testing someone on how familiar they are with the game, this would be a good contender, because it's easily as jank as the control system gets. Surprisingly, it wasn't much of a problem for me throughout my playtime. Maybe a couple of instances where I had to retry it, but it never managed to kill me by throwing me off the edge to my death like some of my nightmare memories would imply. Fisher always bounces off whichever wall he hits first as he jumps, so as long as you take a second to aim, it's pretty easy to consistently hit those multipliers with ease. But stealth doesn't only include sneaking around and remaining undetected. In fact, everything about how the levels are designed in this game scream that you're not supposed to be able to just slip in and out without so much as touching a single person. True stealth runs of Splinter Cell are basically impossible. I've seen people get as close to it as possible, but runs like that require both a metric ton of cheese, as well as incredible map knowledge which you acquire through hours and hours of trial and error. I recommend watching Center Strain attempt this. It's a 3-hour video comprised of just the successful clips, avoiding the many hours of attempts where he failed and had to retry a section.
Next section is the toughest to do without taking anyone out, and oh boy.
Mostly this is down to the fact that some objectives require you to get physical with an enemy. There's one instance where you straight up have to assassinate someone, which is something I can live with. I mean, I can accept that as something that's in the job description. But there are numerous instances where getting important information to progress a mission requires grabbing and interrogating an enemy. Some doors are locked behind retinal scanners, and again, the only way to get through them is to grab a high-ranking enemy, drag them to the door, and force them to open it for you. There is no other way around these objectives. If you ignore them, you can't progress. If you knock them out or kill them before getting what you need, you fail and have to reload the save.
What in God's name do you think you're doing, Fisher? The mission's over.
Even some of the enemy placements suggest that perfect stealth was never the goal when creating these levels. Like this guy early on in the Defense Ministry mission. Sure, I guess I could go all the way back down to the parking lot to grab a bottle, or just make some noise by jumping to lure him away so I can try and sneak past. But he does just stand there like this, looking away from me if I don't make any noise. It's pretty clear that the game wants me to just take the easy option of just knocking him out and hiding his body. And that's all even without mentioning the finest inclusion in the franchise. The forced combat sections. Need I say more? Because I will. Just not now. To round this stealth section off, since we now know that we will inevitably have to take care of a couple of bad guys here and there, let's talk about some of the ways in which we can do that without killing them or raising too much attention. Now, if you need them to give you info or unlock a retinal scanner, then your hands are pretty much tied. You'll need to sneak up behind them somehow, which comes with the challenges I talked about earlier in this section. Otherwise, you have a few more options. Splinter Cell was inspired by some of those classic immersive sims I mentioned earlier. So naturally, we can do a couple of interesting things like yeeting dense objects off of their domes, or dropping on top of their heads if we catch them lacking. Which, even though intuitively it should seem like that would make a fuck ton of noise, it's surprisingly silent as far as the game is concerned. It really makes no sense, like, just listen to how loud this is. Once you find the FS-2000 in the CIA headquarters, you also gain access to a couple of non-lethal attachment gadgets that let you knock out enemies from a short to medium range. The airfoil round and sticky toffee pudding. The airfoil round and sticky shocker are both stealthy, which seems a bit strange to me. Both are silent options unless the person you're shooting them at is standing, like, right next to another guard. Even though when you shoot someone with the sticky shocker, they sound like this. I think there's a bit of a missed opportunity in making these two gadgets a little bit more varied. The airfoil round will only knock an enemy out in one shot if you aim for the head, and I think it would have been interesting if the sticky shocker had the trade-off of guaranteeing an instant knockout at the expense of being louder. Because as it stands with the game as is, I only resorted to using airfoil rounds when I ran out of shockers, which feels weird. They took this in the complete opposite direction in Chaos Theory though, making both gadgets equally overpowered. The final way of taking out enemies is by giving them a good old-fashioned knock on the head with your closed fist. A punch from behind on an unsuspecting victim will result in an instant KO. However, it's not always that easy. Hits from the side are anyone's guess. Sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. And you see, the AI doesn't always like to play nice. Eventually, you will come across a guard with a sixth sense that will just so happen to turn around as you're about to perform the deed. What happens next is, as far as I can tell, entirely up to RNG. If you've alerted the guard, you now have to land 2 hits. And the RNG comes into play for whether he gets stunned by the first punch. Because if he does, you can knock him out with a second one and remain undetected by any other guards that might be in the area. If he isn't stunned, then he's gonna light you the fuck up, screaming and shouting for help the entire time, until your punching ability finishes its cooldown and you can finally knock him out. No matter how you decide to do it, eventually you will have to worry about hiding away bodies, be they dead or alive. The way the first 2 games in the series deal with this is maybe one of the more controversial topics surrounding them. Many of the levels in this game have an alarm system which, if set off, will progressively make things a little bit harder for you up until the 3rd alarm, which fails the mission. If another guard finds a body, he will wake him up if he's still alive. If the body is dead, he will most likely trigger an alarm if one is available. Though clearly that's not a guarantee, as you can see in this clip here. This dude finds his lifeless friend lying on the ground, does a quick sweep, then proceeds like it's business as usual. That's not the controversial part though. The real thing you have to worry about is that if a map has an alarm system, it scans previous areas you've been to for bodies that aren't hidden in the dark. And if it finds one, an alarm is set off.
Man down! He's dead!
That's kind of an interesting concept, but it does feel undercooked. It only really works if you, say, have an area with 10 guards and you only knock out or kill 2 of them. In that scenario, I can accept that one of the other 8 guards I left alone will probably have a pretty good chance of finding a body I left out in the open. But with more aggressive playstyles, where you go around choking or shooting everyone you see, it becomes a little less believable. It's almost like there's this punishing NSA performance inspector following you everywhere that griefs you for not doing your job properly by ringing alarms. The fact that the game only checks to see if bodies are hidden in darkness is not really ideal either. Besides the fact that you could reasonably find a quiet place somewhere out of the way that is otherwise well lit, the side effect is that you can leave bodies out in the open like this, and as long as your light meter is somewhere within that first part on the far left, they still won't trigger an alarm, even though it would be very easy to get tripped up over them. I will say this though, I felt incredibly vulnerable whenever I had to get up close and personal with an enemy in this game, which, since stealth is in the name, should be evidence that Ubisoft Montreal was getting something right. Combined with the alarm system, which gives you the extra work of having to hide every body you drop, the result was that, at least early on, I did feel somewhat incentivized to just try and sneak past enemies wherever it was reasonable to do so. But other aspects related to this game's stealth mechanics, like unlocking more ways to easily deal with enemies from a distance as the game goes on, and the unavoidable combat encounters that happen from the Kalinatech mission and onwards, suggests that there wasn't yet a fully cohesive vision as for what sort of game Splinter Cell was meant to be. And the evidence for that is kind of in the name. The Stealth Action Redefined tagline under the game's title really wasn't meant to be much more than a marketing gimmick, meant to prod at the tactical espionage action subtitle of the Metal Gear Solid games. However, the action part of Stealth Action has a rather pronounced presence here, which really only dipped to its lowest point for one game in this series with Chaos Theory. And really, if you keep this game in mind as both a stealth and action experience going in, you will have a much better time with it. Especially in some of the more ridiculous parts. I've teased it enough already, so let's talk about the forced combat sections. First of all, I don't know who these are meant to be for. Players who bought the game because they thought the box looked cool but ended up not vibing with the core stealth mechanics of the game would have been filtered out far before they ever reached the first combat section that happens towards the end of the 5th mission. If you make it that far, chances are that you really like what the game is putting down up to that point. And then, all of a sudden, you're forced into combat with that same inaccurate weapon control system that clearly wasn't built with this sort of section in mind. Especially if you played this game on console, which, my condolences if you had to go through these parts of the game with a controller. This kind of feels like another influence from the Metal Gear series, though taken without consideration for why the boss battles in those games actually worked. Everything about this feels like it was meant for a different game entirely. Especially the fucking music that they play during every single one of these encounters. I think the overall soundtrack of Splinter Cell deserves a quick section here first though, because a lot of it is really good. I was always someone who was really sensitive to how things sounded growing up. Here's the obligatory music degree mention. And especially the atmospheric tracks in Splinter Cell stood out to me as being very distinct. The composer behind the soundtrack of Splinter Cell is Michael Richard Plowman. He created this interesting soundscape of orchestral and world instruments that changed depending on the setting of a level, and mixed them with synth instruments to create something that still sounds very unique to this day. There is this one sound in particular that reappears in most of this game's atmospheric tracks, which still invokes this Pavlovian response in me to go and hide in a dark place somewhere when I hear it. It's almost as iconic a part of this game for me as Sam Fisher is. I'm not sure what exactly they used to make this sound, but it's almost like hearing distant thunder. It's surprisingly cozy in a way. I think the soundtrack that plays when you're discovered isn't as good, though it does showcase one of the earlier examples I can think of a game's score reacting to changing conditions in real time, which is impressive in its own right.
Intruder!
I wanted to say all of that first because I don't know what the fuck they were smoking when they decided to put this Mission Impossible ass track in every combat encounter in this game. It's annoying because it's clearly trying to convince you that something cool is happening, when in actual fact, when you hear this play, you know you're about to experience the weakest shit this game has to offer. It's almost like a joke, and honestly, it did become funny. I wish I was streaming my playthrough of this, because after 2 or 3 of these encounters, I just started laughing whenever I heard that bass line kick in, like, oh shit! However, these sections did have a negative effect overall in that it cheapened the experience for me. I stopped caring as much about the stealth aspect of this game after maybe the first 2 of these combat sections because they normalized shooting my enemies instead. If you look at my gameplay in the first few missions and compare it to the final few, that gun started to come out a lot more, man. And I don't think that would have been the case if I wasn't forced through so many of these shooting galleries. It was things like this that convinced me of an unrefined vision behind this game. But I think the best proof of this is actually found in the cinematic that plays when you launch Splinter Cell. It does a really good job of setting up this mysterious atmosphere as we watch Sam don all of his equipment before a mission. Right before just straight up turning into an action movie montage with music that is somehow even more ill-fitting than what the combat section has to offer.
You know what you...
When you think of stealth games now, you probably think of big, open levels with many different paths you can take to traverse the environment, and many different ways of achieving objectives. That's really not so much the case in this game, it's more of an adventure. I was actually surprised at how many scripted events I came across throughout my playtime. There are many points in missions where you'll pass a trigger point that spawns a group of enemies to try and catch you off guard, or which magically opens a previously jammed door that allows you to progress to a new area of the map after performing some arbitrary task. You really need to play this game on its own terms and take your time going through its levels. Nowhere was that more obvious to me than in the police headquarters mission, where the game actually teaches you that that's how it expects you to play. Once you actually make it to the police station itself, there is a guard just ahead as you enter the building that is very keen on spotting you if you don't just stand back and let him do his thing for a bit. After that, before the morgue, we get to our very first noob trap of the game. A locked door that, if you decide to pick without first checking what is behind it with your optic cable, will reveal not only a dead end, but a guard staring directly at you, alerting everyone to your presence and probably popping a few caps in your ass for good measure. This is the only instance I can think of where something like this happens in this game, but it's a learning experience nonetheless. The third vibe check is the fact that the morgue, which is where your objective is located, is quite easy to just bypass. Admittedly, I don't know if I had a brain hemorrhage when I did this or something. There's like 20 minutes of footage on my hard drive where I get all the way to the end of this level, realize that I must be having some sort of psychotic episode, then sneak all the way back here to continue with the fucking game. Splinter Cell is, for the most part, a very linear experience. But that doesn't stop it from letting you walk past objectives and into other areas of the map. All that is to say, if you ever plan on playing this game for the first time, but maybe you're a little bit intimidated by the level design, just know that the levels are fundamentally linear, even if they often do a good job at seeming like they're not. Most doors that open do so for a reason. If you explore the map as you go, it's hard to get lost. But there is another example of this earlier in that same mission where the game sort of breaks slightly if you don't take your time. Whenever I've replayed this mission over the years, since I know where I'm going, I just run straight for the zipline right after crawling up the pipe to this roof. The game does not expect the player to do this. That's evident for two reasons. If you just rush down the zipline, you will notice these guys running out of the building towards the van parked outside, where they just despawn as soon as they get near it. The second is this line from Sam.
Don't tell me. You're gonna say it's inside there.
What I discovered by going back to this mission a second time for this video is that Lambert actually has a response for Sam here. If you wait on the roof for those guys to run out of the building and drive away, which also hides the fact that they just despawn, that's when the whole conversation triggers and we can hear Lambert's answer, in which he also explains how Grimm's daughter is able to help you find your way through the building once we're inside.
Don't tell me. You're gonna say it's inside there.
Why would I tell you what you already know? You're gonna have to hurry. Grimm's daughter's comparing a Dark Star drone's sonar to the warehouse blueprints. She'll be guiding you through.
It is kind of amusing to think that whoever designed this part of the mission must have thought that every time someone got to this part on subsequent playthroughs, they would just stand here looking at the burning building again, thinking, you're gonna wanna look at this. Wait, I've gotta get in there? You have got to be, no, you have got to be kidding. At least in order for everything to play out the way it's supposed to. A very similar event occurs directly after this. Grimm contacts Sam, basically telling him to not think and to just do as she says to get through safely. But she does this in such a long-winded way that if you don't take your time to listen to her, her next bit of dialogue doesn't play when it's supposed to. Because right at the end of her thesis statement, she finally tells you that you need to go to a room across the hall. If you do that though, the entire room collapses in front of you and she apologizes. This is a pretty cool moment if it works correctly, but again, if you just run your way through with the type of urgency one might have when inside of a fucking burning building, you might be on the other side of the hallway by the time she finally gets to that line.
Damn, sorry about that.
But there's also a clear clash happening with those stealth and action parts of the game here again. The situation is obviously urgent, and yet the game can't keep up with you if you actually believe that you're in danger. And I said believe because you can actually just slow walk your way through this entire part of the level and nothing is going to kill you. It's fake. So where does all of that leave us at the end of the day? I fear that I might have come off as overly negative towards the end of this video, so I just want to say this. I actually had a blast coming back to this game and finishing it for the first time. It all comes back to something I said at the start of this video, which is that Ubisoft at one point wasn't afraid to take a risk. It's clear to me that the Montreal team wasn't exactly sure what they wanted to do with Splinter Cell. The core stealth mechanics were all there and already pretty much fleshed out for the most part, but they still seemed like they were sort of afraid to go all in on either the direction of stealth or action, clinging onto both in this sort of awkward way. However, the risk paid off. Not only was this game a financial success, but it was also simultaneously successful at establishing Splinter Cell as a recognizable brand. Which, considering that this was the first project Ubisoft Montreal ever worked on, and the fact that, allegedly, half of the team had never even worked on writing software prior to this, is really a remarkable achievement. The most important thing is that they were able and willing to recognize what worked and what didn't about the game. Evidence of which being that their next entry into the series is widely considered by most stealth game enjoyers to be one of the best games of its type. And when it comes to Ubisoft as it exists today, I think that's something that is sorely missing.
I want you to subscribe to me.
Scav Merchant Ho.
On YouTube, thank you, Cringe Podcast.